Hello, I'm standing in front of one of Wichita's most beloved local cultural symbols and landmarks. It's the Keeper of the Plains statue. It's a beautiful day here and I'm just across the river. Let me tell you a little bit about it. It's 44 feet high. It was completed in 1974, made of weathering stone, and it was designed by Native American artist from Kiowa Comanche tribe, and his name was Black Bear Boson. In 2006, they raised it another 30 feet to sit atop the base of rocks that you see. And those burn barrels around the statue are known as the Rings of Fire, and they are ceremonially lit every day of the year, weather permitting, river level permitting, at 9 o'clock in the evening in the summers and 7 o'clock in the winters. And that is a very popular thing to do. If you haven't gone to see them light the Keeper of the Plains Rings of Fire, you should do so. I'm also wearing my Wichita flag t-shirt, and although you might think the Wichita flag is newer than the Keeper of the Plains statue, in fact it's much older. It's just become very popular in the last few years. It was actually designed in 1937 by South Wichitan Charles Cecil McAllister, and it has, in addition to being a great looking flag, it has much meaning. The white symbol inside the blue is the Native American symbol for permanent home, and the blue is the symbol for the sun, which stands for happiness and contentment, and the red and white rays that are radiating represent freedom and a path to come and go as one pleases. It's finished in the top 10 in surveys of American city flags, so we are not the only ones who think that it's a pretty cool looking flag. And in recent years, it's become a cottage industry, basically, of what they call flag swag. You can see the design of the flag on t-shirts, on coffee cups, wine glasses, plaques, billboards, store signs. Last night they announced on the news that we can get for $50 a Wichita flag license plate, and the money will go to the parks. You can also tattoo, if you would like to go to Hellbomb Tattoo or one of the other local tattoo shops. They are doing more Wichita flag tattoos in the last couple of years. And it's interesting, theoretically, sociologically, to examine why it has become so popular in the last few years. And in fact, I would argue there has been a very large resurgence of local culture and local pride in local culture, and not just in Wichita. We're seeing similar efforts and phenomenons going on in lots of other American cities. And what I think it is, at least in part, is a reaction to what we see in the suburbs and in the cities, which is a proliferation and explosion of multinational corporate sites of consumption. And we read about that last week. So we're talking about stores like Cabela's and Target and World Market. I live over on 21st and Greenwich, which is billed as sort of the next rock road. So there are many stores going up, and most of them are national chains that you would recognize, or they're regional chains that are growing into national chains. And so there are Subways and McDonald's and Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and sort of all the stores that you would not only see at 21st and Greenwich, but on streets and in suburbs and in cities all over the United States. And as these developments go up, of course, smaller, locally owned stores, a certain amount of them go out of business. And when they go out of business, they take a part of the local culture with them. So I really think the resurgence in people living in the city and having pride in their downtowns and their local culture and proudly displaying local symbols can be understood in large part as a reaction to the current era of globalization and the globalization of corporate consumer culture. Hello again. Let's talk some more about the globalization of culture. In the literature, there are basically three main paradigms or perspectives about the effects of globalization on culture, and we will briefly examine each and I'll provide some examples. The first one is known as cultural differentialism, and that basically says that globalization actually widens the differences between pre-existing local, national, or regional cultures. It creates difference. This is known as differentialism. The second position is known as cultural hybridization, which says that globalization creates a global culture that then mixes with pre-existing local, regional, or national cultures, or in other words, that the different cultures through globalization come into contact with each other and mix together and create new forms. So this is known as cultural hybridization. And the third outcome of the impact of globalization on culture is known as cultural convergence. And this means that the global basically destroys or transforms pre-existing local, national, regional. Assimilates is probably the right word, that all of the pre-existing cultures over time converge into one large, fairly homogeneous global culture. So I've been using the culture word a lot. What do we mean by culture? The definition of culture is a collection of ideas, values, practices, and material objects that mean a great deal to a group of people, even an entire society, and that allow them to carry out their collective lives in relative order and harmony. So culture can exist in your head as a set of ideas or beliefs or values, but it can also exist as a set of practices in everyday life that we can observe using a number of different material objects that are used in everyday life. And so, for example, one of my first exposures to Wichita as a distinctively local culture is when I visited here the first time and called the Arkansas River the Arkansas River. And there is no faster way to tell someone from Wichita that you are from out of town than to pronounce the Arkansas River, Arkansas River. So let's start with cultures remain distinctively different. This is differentialism. And cultural differentialism does mean that cultures tend to remain stubbornly different from one another, even as they are exposed to each other and exposed to global culture. Civilization is a key term here because Samuel Huntington has written perhaps the best known argument for cultural differentialism, and it's called The Clash of Civilizations, was the title of the book. And civilization is basically the broadest level of culture and cultural identities. And Huntington Huntington constructed 8 or 9 different civilizations as existing in the world. You can read about them in the book, but they include Sinic culture, which is Asian culture. They also include Hindu culture, Islamic culture, Orthodox culture being in Russia, Western Europe, North America, Latin America, and Africa. These are all civilizations, and you can see that they're based either on territory, basically where large numbers of people have lived for thousands of years, and or religions, very large world religions that have been the dominant sort of determinant of cultural beliefs and values, attitudes and practices and so forth. Briefly, Huntington believes that the Cold War basically pitted 2 cultures against each other, which would be, the former USSR, Russia, and North America. But of course, the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world sort of got on one side or the other. Now, as the Cold War ended and as Asia became more economically, politically powerful, and with a large number of Muslims in the world and Islamic culture, Huntington could see only a new form of conflict between different cultures, especially between Western North America and Western Europe and Islamic culture. Because he believes that these civilizations have dramatically different worldview. And he talked about, for example, the arrogance of the United States and Western Europe being sort of ethnocentric and believing that everyone in the world should adopt their culture, versus, when you put that into play and it comes up against Islamic culture, which Huntington says is defined by, among other things, intolerance, then that makes for a conflict or a clash of civilizations. And Huntington said basically terrorist attacks can be understood. These terrorist attacks on Western targets and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are examples of the clash of civilizations. For Huntington, and I find this a little bit ironic, his suggestion is not that all of the different civilizations should tolerate each other, but he believes that the United States must reaffirm its Western identity and reassert its role as a Western leader, so that Western culture basically can be the predominant model. He believes that globalization is a process by which civilizations continue to exist in parallel and largely independently. So he just doesn't see globalization as mixing the civilizations together or replacing them with one large global culture. But there are many criticisms of this argument. It's a very powerful argument and it's logical. However, when you think about how diverse the world is, and to be basically condensed into 8 different civilizations, ignores the diversity within each of those civilizations. And we all know, just within the United States, we are certainly not one homogeneous culture, as every day they're talking about how divided we are in the news, right? And similarly, in Islamic culture, it's not, all people are not the same. So it's a dramatic oversimplification of civilizations to begin with, and a pretty negative and pessimistic view that they can't somehow overcome their differences and cooperate and so forth. But I'll let you be the judge of which theoretical perspective that seems most convincing to you. Right, so let's move on to the cultures become a mix of the global and local, or they become hybrids. And the key terms here are cultural hybridization, and this means that external flows interact with internal flows, and they produce a unique cultural hybrid that combines their elements. And Roland Robertson, who's mentioned in your book, talks about basically the end of the local, and he believes that most things that we consider local are glocal. So globalization is interpenetrations of the global and the local, resulting in unique outcomes in different geographic areas. And every time I think of this, I think of Spangles, because Spangles is basically owned by the Stevens family, who originally came here many years ago as Lebanese immigrants, and very successful. We have a large Lebanese population, some of the best hummus in the United States. But Spangles is an example of the mixing of the culture of fast food, or what we call McDonaldization. I'll talk some more about that in a minute, along with local or ancestral traditional Lebanese dishes. So my favorite food, one of my favorite foods, is the chicken on pita. And I can get chicken on pita, which is a Lebanese dish, but I can get it going through the drive-through at Spangles, which seems very much like a McDonald's. So that is a unique cultural form that is a result of flows of people from the Middle East to Wichita and them starting businesses, but also looking at other existing businesses here and how they operate, sort of combining the two into a unique Lebanese fast food hybrid. And I think there's another place that just opened near me called Medis, which is a little bit more, I'd call that, it's like Chipotle. If Spangles was sort of parallel to McDonald's, I think that Medis has adopted the Chipotle model of serving Lebanese food. All right, so when we talk about this hybridization and the mixing as a result of globalization, the focus is on integration, that these cultures come into contact with each other, and there are flows of people and things and information, and they just form unique hybrid forms. It's a fairly positive, unlike the clash of civilizations, it's a positive view because it basically, the whole theory is that different cultures can come together and produce new and unique things that people enjoy and that people can benefit from. And it's from Roland Robertson, and he's asserting that the world is becoming more pluralistic instead of less pluralistic, as Huntington talked about, and that individuals have power to adapt and innovate. And the social processes here are relational and contingent. So we won't see the same mixing at the same time in all places. This is an uneven process that occurs. And he also says that commodities and media facilitate creativity. And so this is a common theme in the globalization of culture because consumer goods and the globalization of the economy has produced things that are consumed all over the world in different countries, the same things by people in different countries and cultures, and of course the mass media and electronic media where we see things coming together. And so this can result in all sorts of different kinds of hybrids, not just restaurants, but music, language, automobiles, basically anything you can think of could be potentially mixed together depending on which cultures are coming together and exposed to each other and how things are created and come about. Now, the third kind of theory here, theoretical perspective, because there are lots of theories that sort of fall into line with each of these three perspectives that we're talking about today. This is cultural convergence. And this basically says that cultures around the globe are subjected to many of the same global flows. And as a result, they tend to grow more alike. So it basically emphasizes the weakness of barriers that cultures, civilizations can try to keep information or people, places, and so forth, global flows. They can try and block them, but it's increasingly more difficult to do so. And in fact, most nations and cultures are interdependent upon one another today. Cultural convergence does not argue this happens everywhere or that local cultures are all disappearing. Especially, I think, when we're talking about cultural convergence, a lot of it has to do with consumerism and the spread of multinational corporations and sites of consumption. Well, this doesn't spread to areas of poverty, in lesser developed countries. So they may not see cultural convergence like you will see in more affluent countries in the global north. And of course, it doesn't necessarily destroy all pre-existing cultures and make them the same. There are elements here and there that survive, but over time the idea is that local, national, regional cultures sort of assimilate into one big global culture. And Ritzer has done a lot of work in this area, and he's well known for his work. I think I mentioned this on McDonaldization. And this is the process by which the principles of fast food restaurants are coming to dominate more of the world. And it's based on famous sociology, Max Weber's theory of rationalization. So Weber said that as societies become larger and more complex and more civilized, that they become more rational. And in other words, they try and adopt sort of standard practices that will result in achieving the ends in kind of the most effective and efficient way possible. So this is a theory that really applies well to organizations, especially large organizations. And so the principles of McDonaldization are efficiency, calculability, using numbers to basically to become familiar with or to produce things exactly to specifications. You've got to have the right specs, have to be consistent, universal. Predictability. We know in McDonald's, oftentimes when we're traveling, we will choose a McDonald's not because we think it's the best food you could get anywhere, but because we're not familiar with some of the local restaurants, and it may not be the best hamburger and fries, but at least you know what you're going to get, and you won't get food poisoning or something you absolutely hate. That's the assumption we make anyway. I'm not saying that that's the truth, but that is the rationale that many of us make when we go to a McDonald's, even if we don't go there normally. There's also the control through substitution of technology for people as a principle of McDonaldization. So they were the first to come up with the automatic drink machines and the French fry robot, and are continuing to experiment with technology in order to produce a more efficient, calculable, and predictable product in McDonald's. And and then finally, what Ritzer says is this is known as the irrationality of rationality, because although you get a very efficient, calculable, and predictable and highly controlled restaurant establishment, you don't get the best food. And in fact, Ritzer talks about in another book what he calls the globalization of nothing. And McDonald's is a great example, because now you can get more hamburgers than ever before. There are McDonald's everywhere, right? So there is this abundance of mass-produced goods that were made possible by McDonaldization, not just in McDonald's, but in factories and offices and basically every organizational context you can think of. But at the same time, these things, for Ritzer, lose their distinctive cultural content. In other words, they converge and they become one sort of global burger. McDonald's, one sort of global burger, and resulted in the globalization of beef production, whereas because fast food restaurants needed burgers to be the same in every restaurant, no matter where they were, they needed a production method that would create that uniform, homogeneous beef, and that production method has resulted in enormous feeding concentration, feedlots, and concentrated feeding operations. And in western Kansas, large entire communities that are based on the economy of meatpacking plants. And so they're producing all of this beef. But of course, what Ritzer would say is that if you want the best burger in town, you're not going to McDonald's. And so, in fact, if you compare a McDonald's burger to a burger there's a great little restaurant, it's a dive called Sport Burger, and it's on the corner of Hillside and Central. My students told me about it. And I waited in line for a half hour in the drive-thru for these burgers and these fries, and it comes in a paper bag, and it's just a very sort of unique, I just have to say the word dive. The place looks like a Dairy Queen that was closed in 1955. But if you go there, these burgers are really good, and they're distinctively sport burger. And if I brought you this burger and you were familiar with them, you would probably say, oh, that's a sport burger, that's a good burger. On the other hand, I could probably go to 2 or 3 different McDonald's and bring back hamburgers and put them on the table, and you could taste them all, and you wouldn't know which burger came from which McDonald's. And for Ritzer, this is basically the transformation of something into nothing. And it's happening everywhere with the proliferation of chain stores and sites of consumption and mass production. And on the other hand, something is largely it's a largely full social form. It is rich in distinctive content. And I opened up this lecture by talking about Keeper of the Plains and talking about the workroom and the flag shirt that I'm wearing, and the revitalization of downtown and the stores on Douglas and so forth. Those are all kind of on the something side of the spectrum and have resisted. They basically kept the small businesses to a large extent and minimized what you see out on the periphery of Wichita or in the suburbs with all of the national fast food chains and so forth. But if you are on Douglas, it's nice, something cultural distinctiveness and character and content is really nice. But if you've gone shopping on Douglas or eaten on Douglas, you know that it costs a lot of money. So it's very interesting. Ritzer talks about the globalization of nothing, which is proliferating, especially through the global north, because there has to be sort of at least a floor of affluence in many of the poorer countries and so forth. Nothing will not proliferate their local cultures until it becomes profitable to do so. But when it does, and I think I've had you read some articles about Kentucky Fried Chicken in Africa and so forth, they will be there, and the spread of nothing, according to Ritzer, will happen there as well. But for now, it's been more of a phenomenon of the global north, and it's getting to the point where the only people who can afford something, it's not mass produced, like art, for example. Many of us can't afford to buy original art, so we buy prints, right? Which again would be more on the nothing side of the spectrum. And the other place that you will find something, according to Ritzer, this distinct is in areas of poverty, just by virtue of them not being able to afford to replace or to amass the stuff that makes for the globalization of nothing. And Ritzer says, that's when you get into neighborhoods that are distinctive in their character because of crime or poverty or social problem. That's not the kind of something that he's lamenting the loss of. But on the other side of the spectrum, it's very difficult, if you're not at least upper middle class, to enjoy some of the restaurants and boutique stores and so forth that you would find in areas of not just Wichita, but all over the country that are trying to preserve their local cultures. So that's cultural convergence. And there is a word here I want you to remember. It's called globalization. And Ritzer's really good at making up words. So this is a cross between growing and global. And so with globalization, McDonald's fits well. Again, that is mass production, the spread of mass-produced, corporate-owned, large businesses, large organizations with their sites of consumption that amass around the world and make places look very similar to each other in terms of their economic landscape, in terms of the stores and restaurants and organizations that you would see. That is cultural convergence. So let's summarize. Global culture is flowing and moving more easily around the world than ever before. The barriers to the flows of information, people, commodities, etc., are lower than they have been in the past. And in fact, many cultures are interdependent on each other politically, economically. And so this calls into question what happens to the pre-existing culture in nations, regions, or localities. And digital technology is very central to flows of information because people basically develop cultural beliefs, values, attitudes. They learn them from their parents or peer groups or other agents of socialization. And when information can flow from thousands of miles away, the internet, for example, then you're able to basically make adjustments or introduce new cultural practices and form or mix your culture with other cultures more easily because of digital technology. But these flows are complex and barriers still do exist. So really any of whether you're thinking that it's globalization or hybridization or differentialism, all of these things are not going to be uniformly occurring across the world. So it's complex, it's uneven, and but certainly we can find areas, and the reason that these three different viewpoints exist is because there are areas, and I think I've given examples, that make sense in terms of demonstrating differentialism or hybridization or convergence. So I'd like to conclude by telling you no matter which of these theoretical perspectives you think is most convincing, I think there's a great deal of merit in these efforts in our cities to preserve the local, and I just like it to be more affordable for everyone. But if you would like to preserve the local, you can simply do it with your pocketbook. Go out, support anything that is local.